Picture, if you will, the ancient world awakening under a Mediterranean sun. The year is 356 BCE, and somewhere in the rugged mountains of Macedonia, a child's cry echoes through marble halls. This is no ordinary birth. This is the moment when legend begins to breathe. The winds carry whispers of oracles and prophecies. The gods themselves seem to pause, watching as a soul destined to reshape the very fabric of civilization draws its first breath. His name would become immortal. Alexander. But before we begin this journey through time, through battles fought in golden light and cities built on dreams, subscribe to the Dreaming of Past channel. Then, leave a comment and tell us what other fascinating stories from the ancient world you'd love to hear whispered into the night. Now, dim the lights. Close your eyes. Let the world around you fade away. We're about to walk alongside a boy who would become a god, a king who would weep because there were no more worlds to conquer. Listen closely. Can you hear the distant sound of horses' hooves on ancient stones? The story begins now. In the shadow of Mount Olympus, where the gods were said to dwell in eternal twilight, there lived a boy whose dreams were too vast for any mortal realm. Alexander was born into a world of marble and muscle, where the clash of bronze echoed through courtyards and the scent of olive oil mixed with the metallic tang of weapons being forged. His father, Philip II, was a man carved from the very stone of Macedonia itself, broad-shouldered, one-eyed from battle, and possessed of an ambition that seemed to seep from the mountain mists. But it was his mother, Olympias, who filled young Alexander's nights with stories that would shape empires. She spoke of divine bloodlines, of Achilles racing across the plains of Troy, of gods who walked among mortals when the world was young. Picture the boy at 7 years old standing in the great hall of Pella as evening light filtered through tall windows. His hair catches the golden rays like spun sunlight, and his eyes, those strange mismatched eyes, one blue as the Aegean, one brown as fertile earth, hold an intensity that makes grown warriors uncomfortable. He listens to the court bards sing of heroes, but something deeper stirs within him. A hunger, a recognition. The palace at night was a place of whispers and shadows. Servants padded softly across polished floors, their sandals making the faintest whisper against stone. In her chambers, Olympias would hold the boy close and speak in hushed tones of his true heritage. "Your ancestor was Achilles," she would murmur, her voice like silk in the darkness. "And perhaps your father is not Philip at all, but Zeus himself, king of the gods." These words settled into Alexander's young heart, like seeds in fertile soil. He would lie awake long after his mother's voice faded, staring at the ceiling where painted stars seemed to pulse with divine light. Outside, the wind would carry the scent of wild thyme and distant snow, and sometimes, just sometimes, he thought he could hear the gods themselves calling his name. The boy's education began before dawn each day. His tutors spoke of mathematics and rhetoric, of the movements of celestial bodies, and the proper way to hold a spear. But Alexander's mind wandered to greater things. When they read Homer's Iliad, he didn't just hear a story. He felt the weight of bronze armor, tasted the dust of Troy, felt the grief of Achilles for his fallen friend Patroclus. One morning, as mist clung to the mountain peaks like the breath of sleeping gods, a stranger arrived at the palace. He was tall and weathered, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. This was Aristotle, the philosopher who would become Alexander's most influential teacher. Philip had summoned him with a specific purpose, to prepare his son not just for kingship, but for something far greater. In the grove of nymphs at Mieza, where springs bubbled up from hidden depths and ancient trees whispered secrets to the wind, Aristotle began to shape the mind that would reshape the world. They would walk together through dappled sunlight, teacher and student, while the philosopher spoke of virtue and vice, of the nature of courage, of how a man might transcend his mortal limitations to achieve something eternal. "Remember, Alexander," Aristotle would say as they paused beside a clear stream, "excellence is not an act but a habit. You are what you repeatedly do." The boy would nod, understanding even then that these words carried the weight of destiny. As seasons turned and the boy grew toward manhood, strange stories began to follow him. Horses that no man could tame would grow calm at his approach. He seemed to know things he had never been taught, to see patterns in battle that escaped seasoned warriors. The other young nobles watched him with a mixture of admiration and unease, sensing something in him that was both magnificent and terrifying. The nights in Macedonia were long and star-filled, and Alexander would often climb to the highest tower of the palace to gaze out at the world beyond. To the east lay Persia, that vast empire that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world itself. To the south, the Greek city-states quarreled and fought like children, unaware that a power was growing in the north that would unite them all under one crown. But for now he was still just a boy, dreaming dreams too large for any one life to contain. The wind would carry the scent of distant lands, and Alexander would close his eyes and imagine marching at the head of armies, crossing rivers that had no names, seeing cities that existed only in legends. The gods, he believed, were preparing him for something extraordinary, and in the depths of night, when the world was quiet and still, he could almost hear them whispering his name. The morning Alexander first held true power in his hands, the world seemed to exhale, as if recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of fate. He was 16, no longer a boy but not yet fully a man, standing in the council chamber of Pella, with the seal of Macedonia heavy in his palm. Philip was away, campaigning in the distant lands of Thrace, where the wind carried the scent of unfamiliar flowers and the cries of strange birds. He had left his son as regent, a decision that made the court nobles shift uneasily in their seats. They saw in Alexander something that both thrilled and terrified them, a fire that burned too bright, an ambition that seemed to have no earthly bounds. The first crisis came like a storm breaking over summer fields. The Maidi tribe, those wild horsemen of the northern mountains, had risen in revolt. Their raids swept down from the peaks like winter wolves, burning villages and carrying away captives. The council expected the young regent to seek advice, to move cautiously, to perhaps send word to his father for guidance. Instead, Alexander stood before the great map of the known world, his fingers tracing the mountain passes where the rebels hid. The torchlight caught the gold in his hair and cast shadows that seemed to dance with divine purpose. "We march at dawn," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of kings though he had never worn a crown. The campaign that followed was like watching a master painter create his first masterpiece. Alexander moved through the mountains with an intuition that seemed supernatural, anticipating the enemy's moves as if he could read their thoughts. His soldiers, men who had fought beside his father for decades, found themselves following this golden youth with a devotion that bordered on worship. In the high passes, where the air was thin and the peaks touched the realm of the gods, Alexander won his first great victory. The mighty chieftains, proud warriors who had never bent the knee to any foreign lord, found themselves kneeling before a boy who fought like Achilles reborn. He was merciful in victory, wise beyond his years, and when he spoke of unity and shared purpose, even his enemies began to believe. But it was in the quiet moments after battle that those closest to him saw the true depth of his transformation. He would stand among the wounded, both friend and foe, and there was something in his touch that seemed to ease suffering. The soldiers began to whisper that he was blessed, that the gods had marked him for greatness. The seasons turned, and Alexander's reputation grew like fire spreading through dry grass. When the Greek city-states of the south learned of Philip's young heir, they sent ambassadors north, bearing gifts and carefully worded treaties. They found not the rough mountain prince they expected, but a young man who spoke their language with the eloquence of a philosopher and the authority of a conqueror. It was during this time that the horse arrived. Bucephalus, the name itself seemed to carry the weight of legend. He was a magnificent creature, black as a moonless night, and larger than any warhorse the Macedonians had ever seen. A delegation from Thessaly had brought him as a gift, but the beast was wild, untamable, rearing and striking at anyone who approached. The king's horsemen, the finest riders in the known world, tried in vain to break him. The animal seemed possessed by some divine madness, his eyes rolling white with fury, his hooves striking sparks from the stone courtyard. Philip, returned from his campaigns, watched the spectacle with growing irritation. "Take the beast away," he commanded. "He's useless to us." But Alexander had been watching too, and he saw something the others missed. The horse wasn't mad. He was afraid of his own shadow, dancing and shifting in the afternoon sun. Without a word, the young prince stepped forward, his hand outstretched, speaking in low, soothing tones. The courtyard fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause as boy and horse faced each other across the space that separated the mortal and divine. Alexander moved slowly, carefully, turning the great beast until his shadow fell behind him. Then, in one fluid motion, he swung himself onto Bucephalus's back. What happened next would be remembered as long as men tell tales of wonder. Horse and rider became one, moving together with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of the mortal world. They galloped across the courtyard, around the palace, out into the fields beyond, and when they returned, it was clear that something sacred had taken place. Philip, watching his son dismount from the magnificent creature, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "My boy," he said quietly, "you must find a kingdom equal to yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." The words hung in the air like prophecy. Alexander stood beside his horse, one hand resting on the great neck, and for a moment father and son stared at each other across a gulf that seemed to widen with each passing breath. They both understood that this was more than just the taming of a horse. It was the moment when Alexander had announced to the world, and perhaps to the gods themselves, that he was ready to claim his destiny. As winter settled over Macedonia like a blanket of stars, Alexander spent his nights in the palace library, reading by lamplight the accounts of great conquerors who had come before. He studied the campaigns of Cyrus the Great, the tactics of Xenophon, the philosophy of empire that had allowed the Persians to rule the known world for 2 centuries. But it was the Iliad that he returned to again and again, that worn copy that had been his companion since childhood. In the flickering light of oil lamps, he would read of Achilles choosing glory over a long life, of the price of immortal fame. The words seemed to burn themselves into his soul, and sometimes, in the deep hours of night, he would look up from the ancient text and feel the presence of his ancestors, as if they were gathering around him, preparing to witness something that would echo through eternity. The gods, it seemed, were preparing their chosen champion for the great game that was about to begin, and in the silence of the Macedonian night, with snow falling softly on the mountains and the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance, Alexander dreamed of armies and cities, of rivers that flowed backward and mountains that touched the sky. His time was coming. The world was about to change. The night Philip died, the very air seemed to weep. It was at Aegae, the ancient capital where the bones of kings lay beneath marble floors, during the wedding feast of his daughter Cleopatra. The great hall blazed with torches, and the wine flowed like rivers of gold. But beneath the celebration lay currents of jealousy and rage that had been building for years. Alexander was not there when the blade found his father's heart. He was in the mountains, hunting wild boar in the dim light of dawn, when a messenger arrived with news that would change everything. The man's face was pale as winter snow, his voice barely a whisper. "The king is dead. Philip has been murdered." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Alexander stood perfectly still for a moment that stretched like eternity, the dead boar at his feet forgotten, the hunting spear falling from his hand. Around him the forest held its breath, as if nature itself understood that a new age had begun. The ride back to Pella was a blur of thundering hooves and bitter wind. Bucephalus carried his master with the urgency of a storm, as if he too sensed that time itself was fragmenting. By the time they reached the palace, word had spread like wildfire, and the courtyard was filled with soldiers, nobles, and common folk, all of them looking toward the horizon with the uncertainty of people who have suddenly found themselves adrift in an ocean without stars. Alexander dismounted in the midst of this chaos, and something in his bearing, the straightness of his spine, the set of his shoulders, the way his strange eyes seemed to hold fire, caused the crowd to fall silent. He was 20 years old, barely a man by some reckonings, but in that moment he carried himself with the authority of one who had been conversing with destiny his entire life. The body of Philip lay in state in the great hall, dressed in his finest armor, his one remaining eye closed in eternal sleep. Alexander knelt beside his father's bier, and those who were close enough to see would later swear that tears fell like silver on the cold marble. But when he rose, his face was carved from stone, and his voice carried the weight of mountains. "My father built Macedonia into a power that could shake the world," he announced to the assembled nobles. "But he was just the foundation, the building that is yet to come. But claiming a throne and holding it are different things entirely." The news of Philip's death spread across the known world like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, and everywhere it touched, enemies began to stir. The Greek city-states, who had been forced into alliance with Macedonia, saw opportunity in the chaos. The barbarian tribes of the north, held in check by Philip's iron fist, began to sharpen their spears and dream of rebellion. Most dangerous of all, within Macedonia itself, there were those who questioned whether this golden boy was ready for the crown that had been forged in blood and iron. Attalus, the old general who had married Philip's last wife, made veiled comments about the legitimacy of Alexander's claim. Others whispered that perhaps a more experienced hand should guide the kingdom through these troubled times. Alexander's response was swift and merciless. In the space of 3 days, his potential rivals found themselves either dead or fleeing into exile. It was done quietly, efficiently, with the precision of a master craftsman. When the purge was complete, no one in Macedonia doubted who ruled or what the price of opposition might be. But the true test came from the south. Thebes, that ancient city that had once been the greatest power in Greece, declared itself free of Macedonian rule. The Thebans pulled down the Macedonian garrison and proclaimed that the age of northern domination was over. They called upon all Greeks to join them in throwing off the yoke of these barbarian kings. The Council of Nobles urged caution. "Let them test their strength against the other cities first," they advised. "We can deal with the survivors." But Alexander had already made his decision. He would march south, not as a conqueror, but as the protector of Greek unity. It was a masterpiece of political calculation, wrapped in the language of divine destiny. The march to Thebes was like watching a force of nature in motion. The Macedonian army moved with the precision of a well-tuned instrument, each unit knowing its part in the greater symphony. Alexander rode at their head on Bucephalus, his armor catching the morning light like captured sunfire, and those who saw him pass spoke later of feeling as if they had glimpsed something divine. The siege of Thebes was brief but terrible. The city's walls, which had stood for centuries, crumbled before the Macedonian war machines like sand before the tide. But it was not the engines of war that broke the defenders' will. It was the sight of Alexander himself, fighting in the front ranks like a hero from the old songs, his sword moving with such speed and grace that it seemed to blur in the air. When the city fell, Alexander faced a choice that would define his reign. The other Greek cities waited to see how he would treat the conquered Thebans. Would he be merciful, proving himself worthy of their loyalty? Or would he show the iron fist beneath the golden glove? His decision shocked the world. Thebes was to be utterly destroyed, its population sold into slavery, its very stones scattered so that no trace remained of the city that had dared to challenge Macedonian rule. Only the house of Pindar, the great poet, was spared, because Alexander honored art and beauty even in his wrath. The destruction of Thebes sent a message that echoed from the mountains of Thrace to the shores of the Aegean. Opposition to Macedonia was not just political rebellion, it was a crime against the natural order itself. The other Greek cities, seeing the smoke rise from what had once been one of their greatest peers, sent ambassadors bearing gold and promises of eternal loyalty. But in the quiet hours after victory, when the army was celebrating and the spoils were being counted, Alexander walked alone through the ruins of Thebes. The destruction was complete, total, and something in the sight of it seemed to wound him. He stood among the broken stones where children had once played, where poets had once sung, where families had gathered around their hearths for countless generations. A wind rose from the south, carrying the scent of distant seas and foreign lands, and Alexander lifted his face to it, like a man tasting his destiny. The Greeks were united now, whether by love or fear, and the path to Asia lay open before him. His father's dream of conquering Persia was within reach, but Alexander's vision stretched far beyond Philip's modest ambitions. As he stood in the ruins of Thebes, with the stars wheeling overhead and the future spreading before him like an uncharted ocean, Alexander made a promise to himself and to the gods who watched from their golden thrones. He would not just conquer, he would create. He would build something so magnificent, so enduring, that men would speak of it until the end of time. The crown of Macedonia was secure on his head, but in his heart he was already reaching for something far greater. The crown of the world itself. The morning Alexander first set foot on Asian soil, the world held its breath. It was spring, and the waters of the Hellespont stretched before the Macedonian fleet like a mirror reflecting the dreams of gods. 35,000 men had gathered on the European shore, their bronze armor catching the early light, their spears pointing toward the eastern horizon where an empire waited to be conquered. But before the ships could sail, there was a pilgrimage to make. Alexander stood on the windswept cliffs of Troy, where the ruins of Priam's city lay scattered like the bones of giants. Here, where his ancestor Achilles had won immortal glory, he made his offerings to the gods and spoke with the spirits of heroes long dead. The tomb of Achilles was a simple mound of earth overlooking the sea, but to Alexander it was the most sacred place on earth. He ran naked around the burial site as custom demanded, his golden hair streaming in the wind, his young body moving with the grace of a god. Those who watched spoke later of feeling as if they had witnessed something divine, as if the boundary between mortal and immortal had grown thin in that moment. At the tomb, Alexander made his prayer, "Grant me, great ancestor, not just victory, but glory that will outlast the very stones of this place. Let my name be remembered when the stars themselves grow cold." The wind carried his words away. and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled though the sky was clear. The crossing of the Hellespont was more than a military operation. It was a passage between worlds. Alexander stood at the prow of the lead ship, his purple cloak billowing behind him, his eyes fixed on the Asian shore. As the fleet moved across the wine-dark water, he poured libations to Poseidon and the sea nymphs, asking for their blessing on this greatest of all adventures. When the ships reached the far shore, Alexander was the first to leap into the shallow water, his spear raised high. The moment his feet touched Asian soil, he claimed the entire continent in the name of conquest. But those closest to him saw something more in his eyes, not just the hunger of a conqueror, but the vision of a man who dreamed of uniting all the world's peoples under one crown. The first battle came at the river Granicus, where the Persian nobles had gathered their forces like storm clouds massing on the horizon. The enemy cavalry stretched across the far bank, their silk banners bright with gold and purple, their armor gleaming like scales on some great serpent. At their head rode the flower of Persian nobility, men who traced their lineage back to the legendary kings of old. Alexander studied the enemy positions as morning mist rose from the water, his mind already seeing the battle's flow like a master musician hearing a symphony before the first note is played. His generals urged caution. The river was deep, the banks treacherous, the enemy positioned like a fortress. But Alexander had not come to Asia to be cautious. "We will attack immediately," he announced, his voice carrying the certainty of fate itself. "Every hour we delay, our enemies grow stronger. But more than that, we are no longer just Macedonians or Greeks. We are the army of destiny itself." The charge across the Granicus was like watching gods at war. Alexander led from the front, Bucephalus plunging into the dark water with the fury of a storm, his rider's spear seeking the heart of the enemy formation. The Persian nobles, brave men who had never known defeat, found themselves facing something they had never encountered, a warrior who fought as if he were already dead, who seemed to move through their ranks like vengeance itself. The battle was brief but decisive. The Persian cavalry, broken by the Macedonian charge, fled toward the mountains, leaving their infantry to face the wrath of the phalanx. By evening, the field belonged to Alexander, and the bodies of Persian nobles lay scattered like fallen leaves beneath the setting sun. But it was after the battle that Alexander showed the world what kind of conqueror he intended to be. Rather than slaughtering the defeated, he gathered the Persian prisoners and spoke to them in their own tongue. "You have fought with honor," he told them, "and honor recognizes honor. Those who wish to serve in my army will be welcomed as brothers. Those who wish to return to their homes may do so freely." The Persian soldiers, who had expected death or slavery, looked at this golden young king with something approaching awe. Here was a conqueror who spoke of brotherhood, who honored their customs, who seemed to see in them not just defeated enemies, but future allies in some grander design. As the army moved deeper into Asia, liberating Greek cities that had been under Persian rule for generations, Alexander began to reveal the full scope of his vision. This was not just a war of conquest, it was a war of unification. He spoke of a world where Greek and Persian, Egyptian and Scythian could live together under one law, worshipping their own gods, but serving one king. The cities of Ionia opened their gates to him like flowers opening to the sun. Ephesus, Miletus, Halicarnassus, each welcomed him as a liberator, and each became a stepping stone toward the greater prize that lay ahead. The Persian Empire, that vast tapestry of nations and peoples, was beginning to unravel at the edges. But even as victory followed victory, Alexander felt the weight of his destiny growing heavier. In the quiet hours after battle, when his generals celebrated and his soldiers counted their spoils, he would climb to high places and stare eastward toward the heart of the Persian Empire. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Darius III, the great king, was gathering the largest army the world had ever seen. The letters began to arrive as summer turned to autumn. Darius, who ruled an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indies, who commanded the loyalty of 100 nations, offered terms: gold beyond counting, marriage alliances, half his kingdom. All this he would give if Alexander would turn back and leave the rest of Asia in peace. Alexander read these letters by lamplight in his tent, with the sounds of the camp settling into sleep around him. His generals urged him to consider the offers seriously. Here was wealth beyond dreams, security for Macedonia, an end to the constant danger of campaigning in foreign lands. But when morning came, Alexander's answer was always the same. "Tell your king," he would say to the Persian envoys, "that the earth cannot bear two sons, nor can Asia hold two kings. He may keep his gold. I will take his empire." The envoys would depart, shaking their heads at the madness of this young conqueror who seemed to believe himself the equal of gods. But those who served Alexander understood that they were following a man who had moved beyond the calculations of ordinary mortals. He was not just seeking conquest, he was seeking to transform the very nature of the world. As winter approached and the army prepared for the campaigns to come, Alexander stood on the walls of Gordium, that ancient city where the legendary knot had waited for centuries for someone worthy to untie it. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, and the wind carried the scent of distant mountains and unknown lands. Tomorrow, he would face the knot that had defeated every hero who had attempted it. Tomorrow, he would either prove himself worthy of the crown of Asia or fail in the sight of gods and men. But tonight, he was simply a young man standing beneath an infinite sky, carrying the dreams of empire in his heart and the loneliness of destiny in his soul. The greatest adventure in human history was just beginning. The ancient knot hung in the temple of Zeus at Gordium, like a challenge from the gods themselves. It was said that whoever could untie it would rule all of Asia, and for centuries, heroes and kings had come to test their worthiness against its intricate coils. The knot was made of bark from the cornel tree, twisted and woven by hands that had been dust for generations, hardened by time into something that seemed more like stone than rope. Alexander approached it in the grey light of dawn, with only his closest companions as witnesses. The temple was silent except for the whisper of wind through ancient columns, and the very air seemed heavy with the weight of prophecy. He stood before the knot for a long moment, his strange eyes studying its impossible complexities, his fingers tracing patterns that seemed to shift and change even as he watched. "My king," whispered Hephaestion, his dearest friend and closest companion, "perhaps we should seek the counsel of the priests. They say the knot has secrets that are not meant for mortal minds." But Alexander was already reaching for his sword. The blade sang as it left its sheath, and in one swift motion he brought it down upon the knot. The ancient bark split with a sound like thunder, and the coils that had defied heroes for centuries fell away like autumn leaves. "The gods," Alexander said quietly, sheathing his sword, "care not how the deed is done, only that it is done." Outside, as if in response to his words, lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the mountains, though no clouds were visible. The news of the knot's cutting spread through the army like wildfire, and the men who had followed Alexander across the Hellespont began to speak of him in hushed tones that bordered on worship. Here was a king who did not just win battles, he rewrote the very laws of fate itself. But even as his legend grew, Alexander faced a challenge that would test not just his tactical genius, but his very soul. Darius III, the great king of Persia, had gathered an army at Issus such as the world had never seen. The report spoke of 600,000 men, of war elephants and scythed chariots, of nobles from every corner of the Persian Empire bringing their finest warriors to serve under the peacock banner. The march to Issus was like walking through a dream of empire. The army moved through landscapes that seemed painted by the gods themselves. Valleys where wildflowers carpeted the earth in purple and gold, mountains that thrust toward the sky like the spears of titans, rivers that ran clear and cold from heights where snow never melted. Alexander rode at the head of his men, no longer the young prince who had crossed the Hellespont, but something more, a figure around whom destiny itself seemed to bend. He had taken to wearing a mix of Macedonian and Persian dress, his armor gleaming with gold and silver, his cloak purple as the sunset. Those who saw him pass spoke of feeling as if they had glimpsed the future itself. The night before the battle, Alexander could not sleep. He wandered through the camp as his soldiers dozed fitfully around their fires, their dreams filled with visions of the carnage to come. The Persian army was so vast that its campfires stretched to the horizon like a galaxy of stars, and the sound of their preparations, the ring of bronze on bronze, the neighing of horses, the prayers of 100 different peoples, carried on the wind like the voice of fate itself. But when dawn broke over the plain of Issus, Alexander was ready. He had spent the dark hours not in fear, but in preparation of the spirit. He had made his sacrifices to the gods, had spoken with the shade of Achilles, had opened his heart to the divine fire that burned within him. Now, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, he stood before his army and spoke words that would be remembered as long as men tell tales of glory. "Today," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the ranks, "we face not just the Persian king, but the very concept of impossibility itself. They outnumber us 20 to 1. Their army stretches beyond the horizon. Their king sits on a throne that has been touched by the gods themselves. And yet we shall prevail. Do you know why?" The army waited in perfect silence, 35,000 men hanging on the words of their golden king. "Because we are not here merely to conquer. We are here to transform the world itself. Each of you carries within him the fire of heroes. Each of you is a thread in the tapestry of legend. And when this day is done, when the dust has settled and the last sword has been sheathed, men will speak of this battle until the stars themselves grow cold." The Battle of Issus was like watching the gods themselves at war. The Persian army came forward like a tide of bronze and silk, their war cries echoing off the mountains, their banners bright as flame in the morning sun. At their center, on a chariot of gold and ivory, rode Darius himself, the great king, descendant of Cyrus, ruler of the known world. But Alexander had made his plan with the precision of a master craftsman. While the Persian center advanced, he led his companion cavalry in a lightning strike at the enemy's left flank. The charge was devastating, a wedge of iron and flesh that cut through the Persian lines like a sword through silk. The moment came when the two kings faced each other across the chaos of battle. Alexander, covered in blood and dust, his armor dented but his spirit unbroken, looked across the field at Darius in his golden chariot. For a heartbeat, the two men, one young and fierce as a lion, the other older and dignified as an eagle, stared at each other across the divide that separated conqueror from conquered. Then Darius did something that shocked the world. The great king, who had never retreated from any battle, who had been raised to believe that his person was sacred, that his rule was ordained by the gods themselves, turned his chariot and fled the field. The sight of the peacock banner disappearing into the dust broke the heart of the Persian army, and what had been a battle became a rout. The victory at Issus was complete, total, and miraculous. The Persian camp, with its silken pavilions and treasure beyond counting, fell intact into Alexander's hands. More precious than gold, however, were the captives, Darius's mother, wife and daughters, the royal women of Persia, who now found themselves at the mercy of this young conqueror from the northern mountains. But it was in how Alexander treated these royal prisoners that the world saw what manner of man he truly was. When he entered the captured tent where the Persian queens waited for their fate, they fell to their knees before him, expecting death or dishonor. Instead, Alexander helped them to their feet with his own hands. "You are queens," he said gently, "and queens do not kneel to anyone but gods." He spoke to them in their own language, assured them that they would be treated with all honor, that their dignity would be protected as if they were his own family. The Persian nobles who witnessed this scene would speak of it for years to come, marveling at a conqueror who seemed to wage war not just with sword and spear, but with compassion itself. That night, as Alexander walked through the captured Persian camp, surrounded by treasures that would have made Croesus weep with envy, he seemed strangely melancholy. Hephaestion found him standing before a mirror of polished bronze, gazing at his reflection with eyes that held depths no 23-year-old should possess. "What troubles you, my king?" Hephaestion asked. "You have won the greatest victory since Troy. The world lies at your feet." Alexander touched the mirror's surface, and his reflection seemed to shimmer like water. "I was thinking," he said quietly, "of how strange it is that we call this victory. Today I have destroyed the happiness of thousands. I have made widows and orphans, broken the hearts of mothers, sent young men to their deaths, and yet I cannot stop. The gods have given me a hunger that can never be satisfied, a thirst that grows stronger with each drink." He turned away from the mirror, and in the lamplight his face seemed older than his years. "Sometimes, my friend, I wonder if I am truly conquering the world, or if the world is conquering me." Outside, the wind carried the scent of distant seas and unknown lands, and somewhere in the darkness destiny waited with infinite patience for its chosen champion to continue his march toward immortality. The road to Egypt unfolded before Alexander's army like a golden thread spun by the fates themselves. After Issus, the great coastal cities opened their gates as flowers open to the dawn, some in joy, some in resignation, all in recognition that the world had fundamentally changed. The age of Persian dominance was ending, and something new was being born beneath the relentless march of Macedonian feet. Sidon welcomed him with garlands of roses and ceremonies that lasted for days. The ancient Phoenician nobles, their robes shimmering with purple dye worth more than kingdoms, knelt before this young conqueror, who seemed to understand the delicate art of ruling not just with fear, but with respect. Alexander walked through their cedar-scented halls and spoke of trade routes and partnerships, of a future where the wealth of nations would flow not to distant Persian overlords, but through the hands of local merchants and craftsmen. But it was at Tyre that the world learned what Alexander's mercy had limits and what the price of defying him could be. The island city, built on a rocky outcrop half a mile from shore, had stood unconquered for centuries. Its walls rose directly from the sea like the battlements of some underwater god, and its people had grown proud and confident in their impregnability. "Pay us homage," their ambassadors told Alexander when he requested entry to sacrifice at their temple of Melkart. "But do not ask us to open our gates. Tyre bows to no earthly king." The siege that followed was like watching a man wrestle with the ocean itself. For 7 months, Alexander's engineers labored to build a causeway across the waters, hauling stones and timber under the constant rain of arrows and fire ships launched by the desperate defenders. The work was hellish, men toiling in waist-deep water while enemy divers cut the support posts beneath them, soldiers falling to precise shots from Tyrian archers who had been trained from childhood to guard their impossible city. Alexander worked alongside his men, his royal hands blistered from hauling stones, his golden hair grey with dust and salt spray. When Tyrian fireships destroyed his siege towers, he built them again. When storms scattered his fleet, he gathered new ships from every port along the coast. His obsession with taking the city became legendary, and his men began to whisper that their king had been touched by some divine madness. But there was method in this madness. Tyre controlled the sea routes to Egypt, and Egypt held the key to both unimaginable wealth and divine legitimacy. The pharaohs had ruled for 3,000 years as living gods, and Alexander understood that to truly claim the crown of Asia, he would need their blessing. More than that, he would need to become one of them. When Tyre finally fell, the carnage was terrible and swift. The city that had defied Alexander for 7 months was consumed in a single day of blood and fire. 8,000 Tyrians died defending their walls, and 30,000 more were sold into slavery. The survivors would remember Alexander not as a liberator, but as a force of nature, as pitiless as earthquake or flood. Yet even in his wrath, Alexander showed flashes of the greatness that was growing within him. The temple of Melkart was left untouched, its priests unharmed. Those Tyrians who had taken sanctuary in sacred places were spared, and the city's artisans, the master shipbuilders and purple dye makers whose skills were beyond price, were offered places of honor in his growing empire. The march to Egypt was like a procession of gods. The desert bloomed with spring flowers, as if the earth itself was celebrating Alexander's passage. The ancient city of Pelusium opened its gates without resistance, and the Persian garrison laid down their arms before a single blow was struck. Word had already reached them of what had happened to those who opposed this golden young king. But it was when Alexander reached Memphis, that ancient city, where the pyramids cast their eternal shadows across the Nile, that the true purpose of his journey became clear. The Egyptian priests, keepers of mysteries older than recorded time, had been waiting for him. They had read the signs in the stars and the flight of sacred birds, had consulted oracles that spoke in languages older than Greek or Persian. "Welcome, son of Ra," they said as Alexander approached the great temple, and the words sent a shiver through all who heard them. Here in the land where gods walked as men and kings ruled as gods, Alexander was being offered something that no mortal had claimed for centuries: true divinity. The ceremony that followed was witnessed by few and spoken of by fewer still. In the inner sanctum of the temple, where sunlight had never fallen and the air itself seemed heavy with the breath of eternity, Alexander underwent rites that transformed him from conqueror to pharaoh, from man to god. When he emerged, there was something different about him, something that made even his closest companions look upon him with a mixture of awe and unease. But the true test of his transformation lay ahead, in the burning sands of the western desert, where the oracle of Ammon waited at the oasis of Siwa. The journey was perilous, a march across waterless wastes, where men had been known to lose their way and wander until they became bones bleaching in the sun. Alexander's guides warned him of the dangers, begged him to wait for a larger escort, a more favorable season. "The god calls," was all Alexander said, and he set out across the desert with only a small company of his most trusted companions. The march to Siwa was like walking through a vision of the underworld. The sun beat down with merciless intensity, turning the sand into a furnace that could blind men and strip the moisture from their bodies in hours. Twice they lost their way when sandstorms erased all landmarks, and twice they were guided back to the path by flights of ravens that appeared from nowhere and disappeared as mysteriously as they had come. When they finally reached the oasis, it was like stepping into another world. Palm trees swayed in breezes that carried the scent of fresh water and blooming flowers. The temple of Ammon rose from the greenery like a jewel carved from living stone. Its columns twisted into shapes that seemed to move and dance in the shifting light. The oracle received Alexander alone, in a chamber deep beneath the temple, where the voice of the god was said to speak directly into the hearts of mortals. What passed between them was never recorded, never spoken of, but when Alexander emerged from that sacred darkness, his face was radiant with joy and terrible with knowledge. "The god has spoken," he announced to his waiting companions, and his voice carried the authority of one who had conversed with divinity itself. "I am confirmed in what I have always known, that my true father is not Philip of Macedon, but Zeus himself, king of the gods." The return journey to Memphis was a triumph procession. Word had spread throughout Egypt of the oracle's confirmation, and the people lined the roads to see their new pharaoh pass. Alexander, now wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, seemed to glow with inner fire as he acknowledged their acclaim. But it was in the quiet hours after ceremony and celebration that the true cost of divinity began to show itself. Alexander stood on the roof of his palace in Memphis, looking out over the Nile as it flowed northward toward the sea, carrying the dreams and hopes of 30 dynasties in its muddy waters. Hephaestion found him there as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "You seem troubled, my king. Has the god's voice brought you sorrow as well as joy?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant pyramids that rose like mountains built by gods. "He told me many things, my friend, of victories to come, of cities I will build, of an empire that will stretch from one end of the earth to the other. But he also told me—" He paused, and his voice, when he continued, was barely a whisper. "He told me that the price of immortal glory is a mortal life, that I may choose to be remembered forever, but I cannot choose to live forever." The wind rose from the river, carrying the scent of lotus blossoms and ancient stone, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called with a voice like silver bells. Alexander pulled his cloak closer around his shoulders, but the chill he felt came not from the desert air, but from the knowledge that the gods give their greatest gifts only to those willing to pay their greatest price. "Come," he said finally, turning away from the eternal vista of the Nile. "Tomorrow we march for Babylon, and there are still worlds to conquer before the sun sets on my story." But as they walked back into the golden light of the palace, both men could feel the weight of destiny settling around them, like a mantle woven from starlight and shadow, beautiful beyond words and heavy beyond bearing. The morning that would decide the fate of the world dawned clear and still over the plains of Gaugamela. There was no wind, no cloud, just the endless bowl of sky stretching from horizon to horizon like a blue dome painted by the gods themselves. In that vast silence, two armies prepared to write the final chapter of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Darius had learned from his defeat at Issus. This time, he had chosen the battlefield himself, a perfectly flat plain in northern Mesopotamia, where his vast superiority in numbers could be brought to bear. The Persian army spread across the landscape like a living carpet woven from the dreams of conquest. 600,000 men, they said, though numbers become meaningless when describing such vastness. Cavalry from the steppes of Scythia, infantry from the mountains of Afghanistan, war elephants from the Indies, scythed chariots whose wheels gleamed like silver in the morning light. At the center of this ocean of warriors sat Darius himself in his chariot of gold, the eternal flame of Ahura Mazda burning before him, the peacock banner of Persia floating above his head like a fragment of heaven come to earth. Around him stood the immortals, the 10,000 elite guards who had never known defeat, their armor scaled like dragon's skin, their spears pointing toward the sky like a forest of deadly silver. Alexander's army seemed pitiful by comparison. 47,000 men, dusty and tired from the long march from Egypt, their armor patched and their weapons worn from years of constant campaigning. But there was something in the way they stood, something in the set of their shoulders and the steadiness of their gaze, that spoke of iron certainty and unshakable faith in their golden king. Alexander had spent the night before the battle walking among his men, stopping at each campfire to share food and memories, to speak words of encouragement and brotherhood. He wore no crown, carried no scepter, just the simple armor of a soldier, and the easy confidence of a man who had looked into the heart of destiny and seen his own reflection there. "Tomorrow," he told them as the fires burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, "we fight not just for Macedonia or Greece, but for the right to reshape the world itself. Each of you carries within him the spirit of heroes. Each of you is a thread in the tapestry of legend. And when this day is done, when the dust has settled and the last sword has been sheathed, the name of Gaugamela will be spoken with the same reverence as Troy." When dawn came, Alexander made his final sacrifices to the gods, pouring wine and honey on the earth while prayers rose like incense in the still air. The omens were favorable. Eagles circled high overhead, and the sacred fire burned bright and clear. The gods, it seemed, had chosen their champion. The battle began like thunder breaking over still water. The Persian chariots came first, their scythed wheels meant to tear through the Macedonian phalanx like knives through silk. But Alexander had prepared for this. His men opened lanes in their formation, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through while archers and javelin throwers struck at the horses and drivers. What should have been devastation became merely spectacle. Then came the cavalry charges, wave after wave of Persian horsemen crashing against the Macedonian line like ocean breakers against granite cliffs. The sound was beyond description, the thunder of hooves, the clash of bronze on bronze, the cries of men and horses mingling in a symphony of war that echoed across the plain. But Alexander was waiting for his moment, and when it came, he struck with the precision of lightning. He had seen a gap in the Persian center, a momentary weakness as Darius's left wing pursued what they thought was a Macedonian retreat. Leading his companion cavalry in a wedge formation, Alexander drove straight at the heart of the Persian army, straight at Darius himself. The charge was like watching a god at war. Alexander on Bucephalus, his armor blazing in the sun, his spear seeking the center of the enemy formation with supernatural accuracy. Around him, his companions rode like men possessed, their war cries echoing the hunting calls of wolves. The Persian center, which had seemed as solid as a mountain, began to crack and crumble before this wedge of iron and fury. And then, for the second time, the impossible happened. Darius, the great king, the descendant of Cyrus, the ruler of the known world, turned his chariot and fled. The sight of the peacock banner disappearing into the dust broke the heart of his army, and what had been the greatest battle in history became the greatest rout. The pursuit lasted until nightfall, and when it was over, the Persian Empire, that vast tapestry of nations that had ruled from India to Ethiopia for 2 centuries, lay in ruins. Darius's camp fell intact into Alexander's hands, along with treasures beyond counting, and the royal baggage train that contained the accumulated wealth of a dozen dynasties. But for Alexander, the greatest prize was not gold or jewels, but something far more precious: legitimacy. In Darius's abandoned tent, he found the royal regalia of Persia, the crown and scepter that had been touched by the hands of Cyrus the Great himself. When he placed that crown upon his head, he became not just a conqueror, but the rightful heir to the greatest empire in human history. The cities of Mesopotamia opened their gates to him like flowers opening to the dawn. Babylon, that ancient metropolis where the Tower of Babel had once reached toward heaven, welcomed him with a procession that lasted for days. The streets were carpeted with rose petals and precious silks, and the air was thick with incense and the songs of 100 choirs. Alexander entered Babylon not as a conqueror but as a liberator. He restored the temples that the Persians had neglected, honored the ancient gods of the land, and spoke to the people in their own tongue of unity and prosperity. The Babylonian priests, keepers of astronomical knowledge that stretched back to the dawn of civilization, proclaimed him the chosen of Marduk, the king who would bring order to chaos. From Babylon, the army marched to Susa, the administrative capital of the Persian Empire, where the tribute of nations had flowed for generations. The treasures they found there staggered the imagination: gold from Nubia, silver from Spain, precious stones from Ceylon, ivory from Africa. 40,000 talents of gold, they said, though such numbers lose all meaning when describing wealth beyond the dreams of kings. But it was at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital that Darius the Great had built as a monument to Persian glory, that Alexander faced his greatest test as a ruler. The city rose from the plain like a vision of paradise, its terraces carved from living rock, its palaces decorated with reliefs that told the story of empire in stone and gold. Here was the very heart of Persian power, the sacred center where the great kings had been crowned for 2 centuries. The Persian garrison offered no resistance. Darius had long since fled eastward, and his remaining supporters were melting away like snow before the summer sun. Alexander entered Persepolis in triumph, walking up the great staircase where tribute-bearers from every corner of the known world had once climbed to lay their offerings before the peacock throne. That night, as Alexander feasted in the great hall where Persian kings had entertained gods and heroes, wine and euphoria combined with old grievances to create a moment of terrible decision. One of his companions, inflamed by drink and memories of Persian raids on Greek temples, called for the palace to be burned in revenge for Xerxes' destruction of Athens. Alexander, perhaps influenced by the wine, perhaps by the intoxicating sense of completing a circle of vengeance that had begun with his ancestor Achilles, gave his consent. The palace of Persepolis, that wonder of the ancient world, was put to the torch. The flames that consumed Persepolis could be seen for miles, painting the night sky the color of blood and gold. As Alexander watched the fire devour centuries of art and culture, he felt a mixture of satisfaction and regret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had avenged the destruction of Athens, but he had also destroyed something irreplaceable, something that could never be rebuilt. The burning of Persepolis sent a message that echoed across the known world. The age of Persian dominance was truly over. But it also marked a change in Alexander himself, a hardening of something that had once been bright and hopeful. The young king who had spared the royal women at Issus, who had honored the gods of every conquered city, was slowly being transformed by the intoxicating and corrupting power of absolute rule. As winter settled over the Iranian plateau and the army prepared for the campaigns to come, Alexander stood in the ruins of the great hall he had ordered burned, surrounded by the charred remnants of 2 centuries of empire. The wind howled through the broken columns, carrying the scent of ash and the whispers of ghosts. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the mountains, Darius was gathering the remnants of his forces for one last desperate stand. But Alexander barely thought of his defeated rival anymore. His eyes were turned eastward, toward India and the lands beyond, toward horizons that seemed to retreat before him like mirages in the desert. The crown of Persia sat heavy on his head, heavier than gold, weighted with the dreams and fears of 100 million subjects. He had conquered the known world, but in doing so, he had begun to lose something of himself, something that could never be recovered. The hunt for Darius became an obsession that consumed Alexander's dreams and drove his army across landscapes that seemed carved from the imagination of gods. Through the summer heat of the Iranian plateau, They marched, following rumors and whispers, chasing a ghost king who seemed always to slip away just beyond the horizon, like smoke on the wind. The Persian Empire was dying, but its death throes were magnificent and terrible to behold. In remote fortresses perched on impossible peaks, Persian nobles made their final stands, with the desperate courage of men who knew they were defending not just their lives, but the memory of 2 centuries of glory. In hidden valleys where streams ran clear and cold from eternal snows, villages that had never known foreign rule watched the dust clouds of Alexander's approach with the resignation of people who understood that the world they had known was ending forever. It was in the high passes of the Hindu Kush, where the air was thin and the peaks touched the very roof of the world, that they finally caught up with the last great king of Persia. But when they found him, Darius III, descendant of Cyrus, heir to the throne of Xerxes and Artaxerxes, lay dying in an ox cart beside a dusty road, his life bleeding away from wounds inflicted not by Alexander's spears, but by his own nobles. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, and his fellow conspirators had done what Alexander could not bring himself to do. They had murdered the last symbol of Persian legitimacy, thinking to buy their own safety with the blood of their king. But they had miscalculated the nature of the man they faced. Alexander wanted victory, conquest, the submission of his enemies, but he had never wanted this. When Alexander knelt beside the dying Darius in the growing darkness of that summer evening, something profound passed between them. Here was his greatest enemy, the man he had pursued across half the world, reduced to mortality and pain like any common soldier. Darius's eyes, once bright with the confidence of divine kingship, were growing dim, but they still held dignity. "You have won fairly," Darius whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that moaned through the mountain passes. Rule wisely. My people deserve a just king." Alexander covered the dying man with his own cloak, the purple cloak of Macedonia, and sat with him as the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. When death finally came, it came quietly, and the last great king of Persia passed into legend with the grace of a man who had been born to rule, even though he had been fated to lose. The funeral Alexander gave Darius shocked even his own followers. Here was the enemy who had opposed him at every turn, who had commanded armies that sought his destruction, and yet Alexander honored him as a brother king. The body was embalmed with royal spices and sent to Persepolis to lie beside the other great kings in tombs carved from living rock. "He was my enemy," Alexander explained to those who questioned this unprecedented show of respect for a defeated foe, but he was a king, and kings even in death deserve the honor of kings. But the murder of Darius had unleashed something darker in the pursuit of Bessus and his fellow regicides. The hunt through the mountains of Afghanistan and Uzbekistan was relentless, marked by a harshness that Alexander's earlier campaigns had rarely shown. Villages that sheltered the fugitives were burned. Prisoners who might have information were questioned with methods that would have been foreign to the young prince who had crossed the Hellespont. When Bessus was finally captured, brought before Alexander in chains like a common criminal, the judgment was swift and merciless. The man who had killed a king would die like a traitor, torn apart by horses, his body left for the carrion birds. It was justice according to Persian law, Alexander declared, but those who knew him best saw something troubling in the relish with which he watched the execution. The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana dragged on for months, then years. These were lands where summer scorched the valleys like a furnace, and winter froze the mountain passes solid, where local warlords commanded fortresses that seemed carved from the very peaks themselves. Each victory led only to another rebellion, each submission only to another betrayal. It was during this grinding warfare in the roof of the world that Alexander began to change in ways that troubled even his closest companions. The simple soldier king who had shared meals with his men around campaign fires was slowly being replaced by something more remote, more magnificent, and more dangerous. He began to adopt Persian court ceremonies, to demand that visitors prostrate themselves before his throne, to speak of himself not just as king, but as the earthly representative of the gods themselves. The breaking point came at a banquet in Samarkand, that ancient city where trade routes from China met roads from India and Persia. The wine had flowed freely, and old grievances had surfaced like poison in a wound. Clytus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, who had served Philip before him and been like an uncle to the young prince, spoke words that could not be taken back. "You forget yourself, boy," Clytus said, his voice thick with wine and old affection turned to disgust. "You speak as if these victories are yours alone, as if the gods themselves fight beside you. But you are Philip's son, not Zeus's, and these victories belong to Macedonian steel and Macedonian blood, not to your Persian crowns and barbarian ceremonies." The silence that followed was like the hush before thunder. Alexander stood slowly, his face pale as winter snow, his strange eyes holding depths of rage that seemed to burn without heat. "You dare?" he whispered, and his voice carried more menace than any shout. "You dare speak to me of what I am?" What happened next was over in seconds but would haunt Alexander for the rest of his life. In his fury, he seized a spear from one of his guards and hurled it across the space that separated him from his foster father. The bronze point took Clytus in the chest, and the man who had loved Alexander like a son died with Alexander's name on his lips. The horror of what he had done crashed over Alexander like a wave. He fell to his knees beside Clytus's body, calling his name, trying to press life back into wounds that were already growing cold. For 3 days, he locked himself away from the world, refusing food, speaking to no one, lost in a grief and guilt that seemed to age him years in hours. When he finally emerged, something fundamental had changed. The spontaneous joy that had once lit his face, the easy laughter that had endeared him to his men, the quick forgiveness that had marked his treatment of enemies, all of this was muted now, replaced by a more careful control, a more calculated warmth. He was still Alexander, still the greatest conqueror the world had ever known. But he was no longer quite the same man who had wept over the body of Darius or spared the royal women at Issus. The marriage to Roxana, the daughter of a Sogdian chieftain, was a political masterstroke that helped pacify the rebellious eastern provinces. She was beautiful beyond description, they said, with dark eyes that held mysteries and skin like polished marble. But those closest to Alexander understood that this union represented more than just diplomatic necessity. It was another step in his transformation from Macedonian king to universal ruler. The wedding ceremony blended Greek and Persian traditions in ways that would have been unthinkable just years before. Alexander wore robes of silk and gold, participated in rituals that his own ancestors would have considered barbaric, and spoke vows in languages that his father had never learned. The message was clear. This was no longer just the king of Macedonia who happened to rule an Asian empire. This was the king of Asia, who remembered his Macedonian origins. As winter settled over the high valleys of Bactria and the army prepared for new campaigns, Alexander stood on the walls of Alexandria Eshate, the furthest city he had founded, looking out over landscapes that no Greek had ever seen. The mountains stretched endlessly toward horizons where China lay hidden beyond passes that seemed to lead to the edge of the world itself. But it was not north that his eyes turned in those long winter nights. It was south and east, toward India, toward lands where elephants walked like moving fortresses, and kings ruled from palaces built of ivory and gold. There beyond the passes of the Hindu Kush lay territories that made even his vast conquest seem modest, peoples who had never heard the names of Alexander or Darius or even Cyrus the Great. The crown of Persia had been won, but it sat uneasily on his head, weighted with the knowledge of what it had cost him. Clytus was dead, killed by his own hand. His soldiers grumbled about foreign wives and barbarian customs. His closest friends watched him with eyes that held love and loyalty, but also a growing unease. He had conquered the known world, but in doing so, he had begun to lose himself. And somewhere in the depths of winter darkness, as wind howled through the mountains and snow fell like tears from a sky that seemed infinitely far away, Alexander dreamed of roads that led beyond the edge of every map, of horizons that retreated before him like promises that could never be kept. The march deeper into India became a journey through landscapes that seemed painted by divine hands. They passed through kingdoms, where peacocks strutted through palace gardens like living jewels, where rivers ran golden with silt, washed down from mountains so high they seemed to support the very dome of heaven itself. The army encountered philosophers who sat naked beneath Bodhi trees, claiming to have unlocked the secrets of eternity, and princes who ruled from palaces carved entirely from single blocks of ivory. Each victory brought new wonders and new mysteries. At Sangala they faced warriors who fought with weapons of steel so fine it seemed forged by gods, blades that could cut through bronze armor as if it were silk. The siege of the city lasted weeks, not because the walls were particularly strong, but because the defenders fought with a fanatical courage born of religious devotion, believing that death in battle would carry them directly to paradise. When Sangala finally fell, Alexander found himself master of treasures that beggared even the wealth of Persepolis. Emeralds the size of a man's fist, rubies that seemed to hold captive fire within their depths, pearls so perfect they might have been tears shed by sea goddesses. But more precious than gems were the maps the Indian scholars showed him, charts that revealed the true vastness of the subcontinent, territories that stretched beyond the horizon for distances that seemed to mock all previous concepts of empire. "How far?" Alexander asked the court geographers as they unrolled scroll after scroll depicting rivers and mountains and kingdoms whose names sounded like music. "How far to the Eastern Ocean, where the world ends?" The scholars exchanged glances, filled with something that might have been pity or awe. "Great king," the eldest among them said carefully, "the ocean you seek lies perhaps 1,000 miles beyond our easternmost borders. But between here and there—" He gestured at the maps, at the intricate drawings of mountain ranges and river systems that seemed to go on forever. "Between here and there lie kingdoms as vast as any you have conquered, peoples who have never heard of Macedonia or Persia, or even of the Western Ocean you crossed to reach us." That night, Alexander stood alone on the walls of conquered Sangala, staring eastward toward horizons that seemed to retreat before his gaze like mirages. The monsoon rains had begun, turning the world into a realm of water and mist, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the landscape with the voice of sleeping gods. For the first time since he had crossed the Hellespont, Alexander felt the weight of true uncertainty. His army, which had followed him faithfully for 7 years and 7,000 miles, was showing signs of strain that no amount of gold or glory could heal. The men who had marched singing from the gates of Pella now moved through the Indian rain with the weary tread of soldiers who had seen too much, conquered too much, been asked to endure too much. The breaking point came at the banks of the Hyphasis River, where the monsoon rains fell like tears from a sky that seemed to weep for the world's pain. Alexander had called an assembly to announce their next march, to speak of the glorious campaigns that lay ahead, the eastern ocean that beckoned just beyond the next range of mountains. But when he stood before his assembled army, the men who had been his companions in every great adventure, he saw something in their eyes that chilled him more than the mountain winds of Bactria. Not fear. These men had long since proved their courage beyond any doubt. Not disloyalty. Their devotion to him burned as bright as ever. But exhaustion. A bone-deep weariness that came not from any single battle or march, but from the accumulated weight of years spent at the very edge of human endurance. It was Conus, one of his most trusted generals, who finally spoke the words that had been growing in every heart. "My king," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow and respect, "we have followed you to the ends of the earth. We have crossed rivers that had no names, and climbed mountains that touched the realm of the gods. We have conquered enemies beyond counting, and seen wonders that no men before us ever imagined. But," he paused, and in that pause lay the weight of 7 years of constant war. "But we are mortal men, my king. Our bodies are worn thin by wounds and weather, our hearts heavy with the memory of comrades who will never see their homes again. We dream no longer of conquest, but of the wives we left behind, the children who have grown to manhood in our absence, the fields we once ploughed beneath Macedonian skies." A murmur ran through the ranks, not of rebellion, but of recognition. These were the words that had lived in every heart, but none had dared to speak. Alexander looked out over the sea of faces, faces weathered by sun and scarred by battle, faces that had looked upon him with worship and would follow him into the very mouth of Hades if he commanded it. But they were asking him, these faithful companions, for the one thing he found hardest to give. They were asking him to stop. The silence stretched like a taut bowstring. Rain fell steadily, drumming against armor and weapons with the rhythm of time itself passing. Alexander stood perfectly still, his strange eyes moving from face to face, reading in each the same message of loyalty coupled with desperate hope. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, barely audible above the sound of falling rain. "You have been my brothers," he said. "More than brothers. You have shared my dreams and made them reality, carried my ambitions on your shoulders and your spear points. If you say the time has come to turn back..." He paused, and for a moment he seemed not like a king or a god, but like a young man carrying a burden too heavy for any mortal shoulders. "If you say the time has come to turn back, then we will turn back." The cheer that rose from the army was unlike any sound they had made in victory. It was the voice of men who had been given back their mortality, who had been released from a dream that had become too large for human hearts to contain. They would follow Alexander anywhere, but they were grateful beyond words that he would not ask them to follow him beyond the edge of the world itself. That night, as the army prepared for the long journey home, Alexander stood alone beside the Hyphasis River, watching its dark waters flow eastward toward oceans he would never see. The rain had stopped, and stars appeared one by one in the clearing sky, cold and distant as the dreams of gods. Hephaestion found him there as midnight approached, standing so still he might have been carved from stone. "You are troubled, my king?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, where India stretched away into mystery and shadow. "I dreamed once," he said finally, "of marching until I reached the very edge of the world, of seeing the ocean that bounds all lands, of standing where no man had ever stood before. But perhaps..." He turned to face his dearest friend, and in the starlight his face seemed older than his 28 years. "Perhaps the edge of the world is not a place, but a moment. Perhaps we have already been there, and it is time to find our way home." The retreat from India began 3 days later, but Alexander called it an advance toward new adventures, new dreams, new ways of binding his vast empire together. He had conquered more territory than any man in history, but as the army turned westward toward Babylon and the setting sun, he was already planning the next phase of his great design. The world was vast, vaster than he had imagined when he first crossed the Hellespont, with dreams of Asian conquest burning in his heart. But it was not infinite. And somewhere in the space between what he had achieved and what remained undone, Alexander was beginning to understand both the glory and the limitation of mortal ambition, even when that ambition burned with divine fire. The descent from the Hindu Kush into India was like stepping from the realm of mortals into the gardens of the gods themselves. The army that had shivered through bitter winters in the mountains of Bactria suddenly found itself in valleys where flowers bloomed in every season, where rivers ran warm and clear through forests that seemed to pulse with life, where the very air carried scents unknown to any Greek, jasmine and sandalwood, cardamom and cinnamon, mysteries that would have driven poets to madness with their beauty. But it was not just the landscape that astonished Alexander's men as they marched down ancient paths worn smooth by countless generations of pilgrims and traders. It was the sheer scale of everything they encountered. Cities that dwarfed Athens or Babylon sprawled along riverbanks like jeweled carpets spread beneath the sun. Temples rose from the earth like mountains carved by divine hands, their towers reaching toward heaven with an ambition that seemed to mock human limitation. And the elephants. Nothing in Greek experience had prepared them for the sight of war elephants, creatures that moved like living fortresses, their tusks capped with bronze, their backs carrying towers filled with archers, their trumpeting calls echoing across valleys like the voices of primordial gods. The horses of the companions, veterans of 100 battles, trembled and shied at the sight of these moving mountains. The first great test came at the Hydaspes River, where King Porus waited with an army that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of vision. The Indian king was a giant of a man, they said, who stood 7 feet tall and rode an elephant that was larger than any creature Alexander's men had ever seen. His forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands, infantry with shields of rhinoceros hide, cavalry mounted on horses bred in the foothills of the Himalayas, and hundreds of elephants that formed the core of his battle line, like a living wall of ivory and fury. The crossing of the Hydaspes was perhaps Alexander's greatest tactical achievement, a masterpiece of deception and daring that would be studied by generals for centuries to come. While Porus watched the main Macedonian camp across the swollen river, Alexander led a picked force 20 miles upstream on a night march through monsoon rains that turned the world into a realm of water and darkness. The storm that night seemed to rage with divine fury. Lightning split the sky like the spears of gods, and thunder rolled across the landscape with such violence that men could barely hear their own thoughts. But Alexander moved through the chaos, like a man who had made peace with the elements themselves, leading his 18,000 picked troops across swollen streams and through forests where every shadow might hide an enemy scout. When dawn broke over the Hydaspes, Porus found himself facing not just the Macedonian force he had been watching, but a second army that had appeared as if conjured from the storm itself. The battle that followed was like watching titans at war, a clash between two different visions of what warfare could be. The Indian elephants charged with the fury of monsoon floods, their trumpeting war cries shaking the very ground, their tusks and trampling feet dealing death in ways that Greek tactics had never anticipated. But Alexander had learned from every enemy he had faced, and he met the elephant charge not with the rigid phalanx formations that had served him in Persia, but with fluid cavalry tactics that flowed around the great beasts like water around stones. The decisive moment came when Alexander and Porus met in single combat, king against king, in the swirling chaos at the heart of the battle. Porus, bleeding from a dozen wounds but still magnificent in his defiance, threw his final javelin at the golden young conqueror who had come from the edge of the world to challenge him. Alexander caught the weapon on his shield and spurred Bucephalus forward for the killing blow. But when he reached the Indian king, something unexpected happened. Instead of delivering the death stroke, Alexander offered his hand. "How should you be treated?" he asked, and Porus, even in defeat, answered with the dignity of true royalty, "As one king treats another." The generosity Alexander showed to Porus became legendary throughout India. Not only was the defeated king restored to his throne, but Alexander added new territories to his realm and named him an ally and friend. Here was conquest not through destruction, but through respect, empire building not on fear, but on honor. But the victory at the Hydaspes came at a cost that cut deeper than any wound. Bucephalus, the great war horse who had carried Alexander from Macedonia to the edge of the world, died from wounds and exhaustion after the battle. For 3 days, Alexander sat beside the body of his oldest companion, the horse that had been his partner in every great adventure since he was 16 years old. The funeral he gave Bucephalus was fit for a hero of the ancient songs. The great pyre was built on the banks of the Hydaspes, and Alexander himself lit the flames that consumed the body of his faithful friend. On the spot where Bucephalus fell, he founded a city, Bucephala, so that the name of his horse would be remembered as long as men dwelt in that land. "He carried me to immortality," Alexander said, as he watched the smoke rise toward the monsoon clouds. It is only fitting that he should share in that immortality. The march deeper into India became a journey through landscapes that seemed painted by divine hands. They passed through kingdoms where peacocks strutted through palace gardens like living jewels, where rivers ran golden with silt washed down from mountains so high they seemed to support the very dome of Alexander the Great. A sleep story in 12 chapters. The retreat from India was unlike any march Alexander had ever led. Where once his army had moved with the eager step of conquerors seeking new horizons, now they traveled with the measured pace of pilgrims returning from a shrine where they had glimpsed something too vast for mortal comprehension. The very air seemed different, still thick with monsoon moisture and the scent of unknown flowers, but touched now with the bittersweet fragrance of endings. Alexander had divided his forces for the return journey, sending the main body with Craterus through the familiar passes of the Hindu Kush, while he himself chose the unknown path. With 25,000 men and a fleet built from Indian timber, he would follow the Indus River to its mouth, then march along the coast through the burning desert of Gedrosia. It was exploration and conquest still, but conquest of a different sort. The conquest of his own restless spirit that could not bear to retrace familiar ground. The voyage down the Indus was like sailing through a dream, painted in gold and green. The great river carried them past cities where temple bells chimed in languages older than Greek, past forests where tigers padded through shadows dappled with eternal sunlight, past beaches where crocodiles basked like ancient gods carved from living stone. Alexander stood at the prow of his flagship, the wind catching his cloak like divine breath, his eyes drinking in landscapes that no European had ever seen. But it was at the mouth of the Indus, where the great river met the Arabian Sea in a delta that stretched to the horizon, that Alexander performed the ceremony that would define his legacy more than any battle. As the fleet anchored in waters that reflected the infinite sky, he made sacrifices to Poseidon and to the unknown gods of the sea, pouring libations of wine and honey into waters that would carry his prayers to the very edge of the world. "Here," he proclaimed to his assembled officers, as dolphins played in the ship's wake and strange birds wheeled overhead, "here I claim not just this river, or this sea, but all the oceans that connect the lands of men. Let it be known that Alexander has sailed upon waters that touch every shore, has stood where the rivers of earth meet the highways of the gods. The march through Gedrosia was meant to be the crowning achievement of his career, a feat of endurance and leadership that would rival the greatest exploits of legendary heroes. No army had ever crossed that wasteland and survived intact, not even the hosts of Cyrus the Great. But Alexander had conquered the impossible before, and he believed, with the divine confidence that had carried him from Macedonia to India, that he could conquer it again. The Gedrosian desert was like walking through the nightmare of a fevered god. The sun beat down with such merciless intensity that bronze armor became too hot to touch, sand filled every crevice of equipment and clothing, and water became more precious than the treasures of Persepolis. The few wells they found were often dry or poisoned, and the guides they had hired from coastal tribes began to disappear into the vastness, taking their knowledge of hidden springs with them. Day after day, the army struggled across landscapes that seemed designed to break the human spirit. Dunes shifted like living things, erasing all landmarks and making navigation a matter of faith rather than knowledge. Men began to fall, first the weakest, then the wounded, then strong soldiers who simply lay down in the sand and refused to rise again. The baggage train, loaded with the treasures of 7 years of conquest, was gradually abandoned as survival became more important than wealth. It was in the heart of the desert, when water supplies had dwindled to a few precious drops and the army seemed on the verge of dissolution, that Alexander showed the leadership that had made him legendary. A patrol had found a small spring and filled a helmet with muddy, precious water. They brought it to their king, expecting him to drink while they watched with parched throats and envious eyes. Instead, Alexander took the helmet in his hands, looked at the faces of his suffering soldiers, and slowly poured the water into the sand at his feet. "I will not drink," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the desert silence, "while any of my men go thirsty. We will find water together or we will die together, but I will share the fate of the humblest soldier in this army." The gesture electrified the army like lightning from a clear sky. Men who had been ready to give up found new strength in their leader's sacrifice, new determination in his refusal to accept privileges that his rank could have claimed. They marched on through the burning days and freezing nights, sustained not by food or water, but by the knowledge that their king suffered alongside them. When they finally staggered out of the Gedrosia desert 60 days later, barely 15,000 of the 25,000 who had entered were still alive. The rest lay buried beneath the shifting sands, their bones joining those of countless other travelers who had challenged that merciless waste and lost. It was the costliest victory of Alexander's career, a triumph that felt more like defeat. The reunion with the main army at Susa was bittersweet, tinged with grief for the lost and relief for the survivors. But even as Alexander celebrated their escape from the desert, he was already planning the next phase of his grand design. The conquest was complete, but the true work of empire, the binding together of diverse peoples into a single civilization, was just beginning. It was at Susa that Alexander revealed the full scope of his vision for the future. In a ceremony that shocked both Greeks and Persians, he married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, in a wedding that blended the traditions of both cultures. But more than that, he encouraged 10,000 of his officers and men to take Persian wives, creating bonds of blood and kinship that would tie his empire together with chains stronger than conquest. The sight of Macedonian soldiers, veterans of campaigns from Egypt to India, kneeling beside Persian brides in ceremonies conducted according to ancient Zoroastrian rites, was like watching the birth of a new world. Alexander himself, resplendent in robes that combined Greek purple with Persian gold, seemed to embody this fusion of cultures, this dream of unity that transcended the traditional boundaries between victor and vanquished. But not everyone shared Alexander's vision of cultural synthesis. The old guard among his officers, men who had served under Philip and remembered when Macedonia was a simple mountain kingdom, watched these developments with growing unease. They had followed Alexander to the ends of the earth, expecting to return as conquering heroes to familiar homes. Instead, they found themselves citizens of a world empire where Greek and Persian, Egyptian and Indian were to be equals. The tensions came to a head at Opis, where Alexander announced his plan to discharge his veteran soldiers and replace them with Persian troops trained in Macedonian tactics. What was meant as a reward for years of faithful service was seen by many as a betrayal, a rejection of the men who had made his conquests possible. The mutiny that followed was brief but traumatic. For the first time in his career, Alexander faced the open rebellion of men who loved him but could no longer follow him. The confrontation was resolved not by force but by emotion, Alexander's tearful reminder of all they had shared, all they had accomplished together, all the bonds of brotherhood that tied them closer than blood. When the veterans finally departed for Macedonia, many with Persian wives and mixed-blood children, they carried with them the seeds of a new kind of civilization. They were no longer simply Greeks returning home, but ambassadors of a world culture that would outlast the empire that created it. As autumn settled over Mesopotamia and the great rivers ran full with mountain snow, Alexander stood on the walls of Babylon, looking out over the city that had become the beating heart of his empire. The palace was filled with ambassadors from every corner of the known world, Scythians from beyond the northern steppes, Celts from the forests of Europe, envoys from kingdoms so distant their names were like music from another realm. But in the quiet hours after the day's audiences, when the palace settled into sleep and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, Alexander felt the weight of loneliness that comes to those who stand too far above their fellow men. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a boy reading Homer by lamplight, had surpassed even the greatest heroes of legend. Yet somehow, in the moment of ultimate triumph, victory felt strangely hollow. The world was his, but what did it mean to possess something so vast that it could never truly be grasped? He had united East and West, but in doing so he had become a stranger to both. He was worshipped as a god, but gods he was beginning to understand are condemned to an eternal solitude that no mortal love can breach. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called with a voice like silver bells, and Alexander pulled his cloak closer around his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new audiences, new decisions, new challenges of governing an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But tonight, he was simply a man of 30 years standing beneath an infinite sky, carrying the dreams of the world in his heart and the weight of divinity on his shoulders. In the final months of his life, Alexander became possessed by a vision so magnificent and impossible that even his closest companions wondered if the gods had blessed him with divine madness or cursed him with mortal folly. He would build a new capital, he declared, that would surpass even Babylon in its splendor, a city that would be the wonder of the world and the eternal monument to his dream of unity between East and West. The plans he drew in the sand of his palace courtyard seemed like the fantasies of a mind drunk on its own power. Pyramids that would dwarf those of Egypt, harbors that could shelter 1,000 ships, temples dedicated to the gods of every nation under his rule. Streets paved with marble from distant quarries, gardens that would bloom with flowers from every corner of the earth, libraries that would preserve the wisdom of all mankind in scrolls of silk and gold. Here, he said to the architects and engineers who gathered around him like disciples around a prophet. Here we will build the heart of the world. Not a Greek city or a Persian city, but something new. A place where the children of Zeus and Ahura Mazda, of Ammon and Marduk, can live together as brothers. The site he chose was at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the two great rivers of Mesopotamia joined their waters before flowing into the Persian Gulf. It was a place already sacred to a dozen different peoples, where trade routes from India met roads from Egypt, where the very geography seemed to whisper of destiny and convergence. But even as Alexander dreamed of his eternal city, his mortal body was beginning to betray the divine spirit that had driven it beyond all human limits. The wounds accumulated over 13 years of constant campaigning, the fevers contracted in Indian swamps, the exhaustion of crossing the Gedrosia desert. All of these had taken their toll on a frame that seemed too slight to contain such enormous ambitions. Those closest to him began to notice changes that they dared not speak aloud. The golden hair that had caught sunlight like captured fire was showing threads of silver, though he was barely 31 years old. The strange eyes that had once burned with the certainty of destiny now sometimes held depths of weariness that seemed to echo from beyond the grave. And there were nights when he would wake screaming from dreams that he could never quite remember, dreams that left him shaking and pale until the dawn drove them away. The death of Hephaestion shattered something in Alexander that could never be repaired. His dearest friend, his closest companion, the man who had shared every adventure from the wrestling grounds of Mieza to the palaces of Persepolis, fell victim to a fever in the autumn of 324. No amount of gold could buy a cure. No prayers to any god could turn aside the fate that claimed the one person Alexander loved without reservation or political calculation. For days after Hephaestion's death, Alexander locked himself away from the world, refusing food, speaking to no one, lost in a grief so profound it seemed to age him years in hours. When he finally emerged, something fundamental had changed. The spontaneous joy that had once lit his face, the easy laughter that had endeared him to his soldiers, the quick forgiveness that had marked his treatment of enemies, all of this was gone, replaced by a terrible intensity that burned like a fever in his eyes. The funeral he gave Hephaestion was beyond magnificent. It was an act of defiance against death itself. A pyre was built that rose like a ziggurat toward the sky, decorated with gold and ivory, precious stones and silk tapestries. The ceremonies lasted for days, with sacrifices and games, with processions that seemed to involve every living soul in Babylon. When the flames finally consumed Hephaestion's body, the smoke could be seen for 100 miles, rising toward heaven like a prayer made visible. "He was the other half of my soul," Alexander said, as he watched the fire burn. "Without him, I am only half a man, half a king, half a god. But perhaps that is enough to finish what we began together." The final months of Alexander's life were marked by a frenetic energy that exhausted everyone around him. He threw himself into the planning of new campaigns with the desperation of a man trying to outrun his own mortality. There would be expeditions to Arabia, he declared, to explore the mysterious lands beyond the Red Sea. Fleets would be built to circumnavigate Africa, following the route that Herodotus claimed the Phoenicians had taken centuries before. The Western Mediterranean beckoned, with its barbarous but wealthy kingdoms that had never felt the tread of civilized armies. But most ambitious of all was his dream of the new capital, the city that would be his eternal monument. Work began immediately, with tens of thousands of laborers drawn from every corner of his empire. Stone was quarried in distant mountains and floated down the great rivers on barges that groaned under impossible loads. Architects arrived from Greece and Egypt, from India and Persia, each bringing the wisdom of their ancient traditions to blend into something unprecedented. The foundations were laid with ceremonies that invoked the gods of every nation under Alexander's rule. Greek priests poured libations to Zeus and Athena, while Persian magi tended sacred fires, and Egyptian astronomers calculated the most auspicious alignment of the stars. It was to be a city where all faiths could flourish, where the accumulated wisdom of the world could be preserved and studied, where the dream of human unity could take physical form in stone and gold. But as spring turned to summer in that final year, Alexander's health continued to decline in ways that could no longer be hidden from public view. The fevers came more frequently now, leaving him weak and pale, struggling to maintain the superhuman energy that had always been his trademark. His generals watched with growing alarm, as their golden king seemed to burn away before their eyes, like a candle consuming itself too quickly. The end came suddenly, without the dramatic battlefield death that everyone had expected for the man who had led more charges than any general in history. It was at a banquet in honor of his admiral Nearchus, as wine flowed freely and old stories were told of adventures in lands where no Greek had ever walked. Alexander rose to propose a toast, his cup raised high, his voice still carrying the authority that had commanded the loyalty of nations. But as he lifted the wine to his lips, something seized him, a pain so sudden and sharp that he doubled over, the cup falling from his hands to shatter on the marble floor like a crystal prophecy of doom. He was carried to his bed, burning with fever, his breath coming in shallow gasps that seemed to echo from some deep cavern in his chest. For 10 days he lingered between life and death, sometimes lucid enough to give orders for the governance of his empire, sometimes lost in delirium where he spoke with the shades of Achilles and Hephaestion, with his father Philip and his enemy Darius. His generals gathered around his bedside like mourners at a shrine, watching the slow dimming of the light that had illuminated their world for 13 incredible years. On the final morning, as dawn broke over Babylon with the golden radiance that had always seemed to follow in Alexander's wake, he opened his eyes one last time. Those strange mismatched orbs, one blue as the Aegean, one brown as fertile earth, fixed on the faces gathered around his bed with a clarity that seemed to pierce the veil between mortal and divine. "To the strongest," he whispered, when they asked who should inherit his empire, and those were the last words he ever spoke. The hand that had held scepters and swords, that had poured libations to gods and built cities that would outlast pyramids, fell still at last. Alexander the Great died as the sun reached its zenith on a day in early summer, when all the world seemed poised between spring's promise and autumn's fulfillment. He was 32 years old, and in his brief life he had changed the course of human history more than any man before or since. Outside in the streets of Babylon, a wind rose from the east, carrying the scent of distant spices and unknown flowers, and somewhere in that wind, those who knew how to listen could hear the echo of marching feet, the ring of bronze on bronze, the voice of a young king calling his men to follow him beyond the edge of every map, into the realm of legend itself. The silence that followed Alexander's death was like the hush that comes after thunder, when the world seems to hold its breath and wait for the next lightning strike. In the great palace of Babylon, where the body of the world's greatest conqueror lay in state surrounded by treasures from every corner of the known earth, his generals gathered like wolves around a fallen lion, each calculating the weight of his own ambition against the terrible legacy they had inherited. For 7 days, no one could agree on what should be done with the empire that stretched from Macedonia to India, from the Caspian Sea to the cataracts of the Nile. The body of Alexander lay on a golden bier, dressed in the armor he had worn at Gaugamela, the crown of Persia gleaming on his golden hair. his face peaceful as if he were merely sleeping between campaigns. But even in death, he seemed to command a presence that made mortal men feel small and temporary. The arguments that raged in the council chamber would have consequences that echoed through centuries. Should the empire be held together under a single regent? Should it be divided among the generals who had conquered it? What of Alexander's infant son by Roxana, not yet born when his father died? What of his half-brother Aridaeus, legitimate heir, but weak of mind? The questions multiplied like fractures in ice, each one threatening to shatter the unity that Alexander had forged with blood and genius. But while his successors quarreled over the division of territories and treasures, something more profound was already taking shape in the hearts and minds of those who had known Alexander or heard his story. The man was dead, but the legend was immortal, growing stronger with each telling, spreading across the world like seeds carried on the wind. In the Greek cities, where democracy had been ancient when Alexander was born, old men gathered in the agora to speak of the Golden Prince who had made the name Hellene known from Spain to China. They told of his victory at Granicus, where he had charged like Achilles reborn, of his mercy at Issus, where he had honored the dignity of royal women, of his tears at Bucephalus's funeral, when he had shown that even conquerors must bow to the great democracy of death. In Persia, the court poets began to weave Alexander into the ancient cycles of heroes and kings, making him not a foreign conqueror, but the latest in the long line of world rulers chosen by Ahura Mazda to bring order to chaos. They sang of how he had honored Darius in death, how he had rebuilt the temples that his own armies had destroyed, how he had dreamed of a world where Persian and Greek could stand as equals beneath the eternal sky. In Egypt, the priests added his name to the sacred cartouches of pharaohs who had ruled as living gods for 3,000 years. They spoke of how he had made pilgrimage to the oracle of Ammon, how the god had acknowledged him as a true son, how his reign had restored the ancient glories that foreign rulers had allowed to decay. In the temple of Karnak, scribes carved his deeds in hieroglyphs that would endure until the Nile itself ran dry. But perhaps the most enduring monument to Alexander's vision was not built of stone or gold, but of human dreams and aspirations. In the cities he had founded, Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria Escate in the far north, Bucephala on the banks of the Hydaspes, Greek settlers married local women, learned local languages, worshipped local gods alongside their ancestral deities. The children of these unions grew up as citizens of a world that transcended the narrow loyalties of tribe and city, speaking Greek and Persian with equal fluency, at home in the temples of Zeus and the fire altars of Zoroaster. The great library of Alexandria became the beating heart of this new civilization, where scholars from every corner of the known world gathered to preserve and study the accumulated wisdom of mankind. Indian mathematicians worked alongside Egyptian astronomers, Persian historians collaborated with Greek philosophers, and slowly, patiently, they began to weave together the scattered threads of human knowledge into a tapestry worthy of Alexander's vision. Trade routes that had been tentative paths became highways of commerce and culture. Silk from China traveled west to clothe Roman senators, while Greek wine flowed east to grace the tables of Indian rajas. Spices from the Indies flavored dishes in Macedonian homes, while Greek architectural styles appeared in temples from Bactria to Babylon. The world had become smaller, more connected, more aware of its own vast diversity and underlying unity. Yet even as Alexander's dream of cultural synthesis took root and flowered, the political empire he had built began to fragment. His generals, the Diadochi, carved up his territories like birds of prey dividing a carcass. Ptolemy claimed Egypt and founded a dynasty that would rule the Nile for 3 centuries. Seleucus took the vast eastern territories, and built an empire that stretched from Syria to the Oxus. Antigonus seized Asia Minor and dreamed of reuniting Alexander's conquests under his own crown. The wars that followed were brutal and endless, as ambitious men sought to claim the inheritance of a king who had transcended mortality in life and seemed determined to elude it in death as well. Cities changed hands like pieces on a game board. Armies marched and countermarched across landscapes that had known peace under Alexander's rule, and gradually the unity he had created gave way to the familiar chaos of competing ambitions. But the idea survived the destruction of the empire. In Rome, where a republic of farmers and soldiers was slowly building its own path to world dominion, young men read accounts of Alexander's campaigns and dreamed of their own marches to glory. Julius Caesar wept before a statue of Alexander, lamenting that at the age when the Macedonian had conquered the world, he himself had accomplished nothing worthy of memory. In the distant kingdoms of the East, where Buddhism was spreading along the trade routes that Alexander's armies had secured, monks carried images of the Golden King who had honored their teachers and protected their monasteries. The Indian sculptures of Gandhara blended Greek artistic techniques with Buddhist religious themes, creating works of art that embodied Alexander's dream of cultural fusion in marble and bronze. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the story of Alexander grew into something larger than history. It became myth, legend, a tale told by firelight to children who had never heard of Macedonia or Persia, but who understood instinctively the appeal of a hero who had dared to dream beyond the limits of the possible. In medieval Europe, where feudal lords ruled tiny domains and dreamed of distant crusades, Alexander appeared in illuminated manuscripts as a Christian knight avant la lettre, a hero who had prepared the way for the spread of the true faith by uniting the world under a single crown. The romance of Alexander became one of the most popular stories of the age, retold in every language from Iceland to Byzantium. In the Islamic world, where scholars preserved and expanded upon the wisdom of antiquity, Iskandar became a figure of wisdom and justice, a king who had sought not just conquest, but understanding. The Persian poet Firdausi made him a central figure in the Shahnameh, the great epic of Iranian identity, while Arabic chroniclers praised his respect for learning and his protection of holy places. Even today, more than 2 millennia after his death, Alexander's name resonates across the world with a power that seems to transcend the ordinary limits of historical memory. In the highlands of Afghanistan, where his armies once marched and his cities once flourished, tribal elders still tell stories of Sikander, the Golden King who brought both war and wonder to their mountain valleys. In the schools of Greece, children learn of the Macedonian prince who carried Hellenic culture to the ends of the earth and made the name of Greece synonymous with civilization itself. Perhaps this is Alexander's truest victory, not the conquest of territories that time has redistributed among other rulers, not the accumulation of treasures that have long since been scattered or melted down, but the conquest of human imagination itself. He showed the world what was possible when vision and will combined with the divine spark of greatness, when a mortal man dared to dream with the ambition of gods. In the end, as the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance and civilizations rise and fall like waves upon an endless shore, the story of Alexander endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit: the hunger for transcendence, the desire to push beyond every boundary and limitation, the hope that somewhere in the vast expanse of possibility there are still worlds waiting to be conquered by those brave enough to seek them. The boy who dreamed of matching Achilles' glory achieved something greater than his hero ever imagined. He became a dream himself, an eternal inspiration that whispers to every generation, "The world is larger than you know, more wonderful than you can imagine, and waiting always for those with the courage to claim it." And in that whisper, carried on winds that blow from Afghanistan to Egypt, from India to the shores of the Atlantic. The voice of Alexander lives on, calling still to the adventurous spirits of mankind. Follow me, he seems to say, beyond the edge of every map, into the realm where mortal ambition touches the infinite sky. The king is dead. Long live the dream.